Adam is one of these people, I think, who I came across his work when trying to find articles that would kind of show that the medievals had something to contribute to the discussion of the atonement. And there's a nice article you wrote on Aquinas as both kind of penal and satisfaction in his kind of approach to atonement, which I found very, very helpful at times. So did my students. You were trained at Biola, but also then at PTS and then at TEDS, and then have got back to the West Coast. And you're someone who doesn't just make the atonement sort of a thing of your own and be Mr. Atonement, but you're also somebody who facilitates other people's input, and you've edited a number of books as well as sole authoring others. So it's great to have you here, Adam. Thanks so much for coming all this way. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say about reframing the doctrine of the atonement, divine simplicity, recent studies of the tabernacle, and Christ's atoning work. Thanks, Adam.
An honor to be here, and I've had lots of fun already. The danger. Hi, it's good to be here. I've already had a great time. You all are lots of fun to be with, so thank you. A danger in the history of the doctrine of the atonement when it comes to thinking about divine presence and the sacrificial system, the tabernacle, is that it ends up being used in a generic way to serve other purposes. So, for example, in Protestant theology and evangelical theology, it often gets lumped into arguments about penal substitution, for example. So the first two papers have been excellent in allowing sort of the dignity and the different dimensions of what's going on in that whole trajectory in Scripture to just emerge in their glory, and I'm grateful for that. What I'm going to try to do is something a little bit ironic. So after a wonderful Roman Catholic exposition of Scripture, I'm going to give an evangelical exposition of history of doctrine. And I'm going to try to situate the first two studies and why they matter so much. So say, hey, amen to these, and here's why they matter given contemporary discussions about the atonement. So if you want to understand the doctrine of the atonement in the last 200 years and what's been going on and why, there are three figures in particular that you ought to attend to: Napoleon, the Frenchman, Francis Bacon, and Schleiermacher. So if you don't understand those three figures, you won't understand the history of the doctrine of the atonement in the last 200 years. So when Napoleon and the French absolutely decimated Prussia, they had sort of a national reckoning to do. Like they'd been utterly humiliated. And so they had a large cultural rebuilding project that they had to undergo. And as part of that, we had the University of Berlin sort of as the kind of the leading edge of the scholarly, reestablishment of Prussia. Within that, we had this significant change from the scientific revolution coming from Francis Bacon, and the immense progress made in understanding the physical sciences. They were just incredibly enviable. Like this was amazing. This was the standard by which things can and will be judged because of the amazing, unprecedented progress that we've had. So in order to reestablish ourselves, we're going to make a scientific university system. How does that relate to the humanities and then to theology? The humanities took their lead from the growth of history as a discipline rooted in the history of philology, which had developed a whole series of tools by means of which it could be scientific in thinking through the origin and development of language. Those tools ended up branching off into a distinct field of history, which before hadn't been its own thing. Like Thomas Aquinas couldn't have gone, to the university or when he was teaching in Paris or something, you couldn't have gone there and majored in history. That wasn't a thing. You would interact with sources from throughout history, but there weren't historians or a field or discipline known as history. So this was emerging right around this time. So in the humanities, if you wanted to belong in the Prussian university system, you had to be historical. It was the history of things that made your discipline matter. So Schleiermacher comes along and he says, okay, theology is scientific. How is it scientific? By being the history of religious experience. And we can trace that from his speeches into the Christian faith and then the brief outline. But basically, theology became the history of theology or the history of religious experience. So let's set that kind of vision aside for the moment. So with that bit of context about Berlin and Prussia and those changes happening from 1800 to 1830, set that aside for a moment. Prior to Schleiermacher, how did theologians think about the doctrine of the atonement? The motto was basically, let me count the ways. So I tell my students all the time something like, well, if you ask me, is my wife beautiful or is she wise? Well, I'm annoyed. I'm not going to answer the question. It's a bad question. My wife is many things, both of those, and many others. And if you ask me which one is she, well, go away. But if you ask me to tell you about my wife, then great. I'll tell you all sorts of things about my wife and how amazing she is. That's the basic spirit of how a theologian approached the death and resurrection of Christ prior to 1800. And so there is just fantastic consensus with a whole bunch of intramural debate going from Irenaeus to Augustine, Athanasius, Maximus Confessor, John of Damascus, into the medievals. The general spirit is that basically Thomas Aquinas, he'll ask, was it necessary that God become man? Was it fitting that he die on a cross? He'll ask these questions. And the answer he gives is, well, it's not an answer. There are 7 answers. There are 10 answers. There are 3 answers. And if you add them all up, like he has several dozen answers to why did God become man? Why the death and resurrection? There is no one answer. We tend to approach the history of doctrine through the lens of Anselm, who was, so far, he is the most focused and single-minded theologian I've found prior to 1800 when it comes to the death and resurrection. Prior to would that be 1600? When it comes to death and resurrection. Because he's pursuing one single line of thought, trying to find the elegant fittingness of the death and resurrection, why God became man. He's exceptional within medieval theology and patristic theology. If we view it from the lens of Thomas Aquinas or Bonaventure or what have you, the general spirit is, let me count the ways. There are all these aspects or dimensions that are going on that make the death and resurrection, incarnation, death and resurrection, a fitting act of the triune God. So along the line, there's large-scale consensus with all sorts of intramural debates about particular questions. But in this case, it's just really helpful. Let's just take some theologians whose names begin with A, okay? Augustine, Anselm, Abelard, Aquinas. Let's just start with those, right? The consensus among them is astounding. And just to be fun, I could kind of come up with quotes and then play a game like which theologian said these things. And it ends up being remarkably hard to do, including with Abelard. So if you work your way through his full Romans commentary, his hymns, his letters, other treatises, what you find is he's boring because he's saying all the same things that his forebears had said, right? And now for other reasons, he got a lot of attention. From Bernard of Clairvaux, especially. But there's this large scale, lots is going on in death, the resurrection of Christ. Let's be more worried about leaving anything out. That's the big worry. Let's try to not leave anything out. So what happens when Schleiermacher and that influence of the University of Berlin of historicist thinking hits theology and hits the doctrine of the atonement? It happens through the theology of F.C. Bauer. So Schleiermacher is the first to set up the method, and he breaks the doctrine of the atonement into what were the three terms? I think it's not exemplarist, but it's something like that. The mystical and the mythical, and he kind of outlines three main theories that he sees in the doctrine before him. F.C. Bauer in 1835, that's off the top of my head, published A History of the Doctrine of Reconciliation. That one is the first combination of Schleiermacher's view of history with Hegel's idealism, and it says, look, we can divide the history of the church into eras, and those eras were governed by ways of capturing sort of a spirit given expression in a formal conceptual way that can be organized in terms of theories. And that we can trace the development of that spirit and its conceptualization throughout these eras and describe them in terms of competing theories, even though the fundamental experience might be one that has continuity. The sort of the idealistic expression of that experience in theories, that varies, and we have these competing theories. So what we're used to, which comes from Gustave Aulin, there are three main theories in the history of the doctrine of the church, right? There's the exemplarist, there's the satisfaction accounts that end up becoming penal substitution, and then there's the Christus Victor account. So Christus Victor is the original for the first 1,000 years, and then you get Anselm and his satisfaction, which became penal substitution in the Protestants. And then there's the exemplarist coming from Abelard, and then 18th century and beyond. We're used to that. There are the three main theories. Problem is that theory language is coming from Schleiermacher and Bauer, and it views a history in terms of oppositional, self-contained accounts of religious experience in a way that does complete injustice to the history of doctrine. Yeah. So we're beholden to this language. We think in terms of theories. I was setting up to go off to grad school, and a wizened Episcopalian priest kind of looked at me with a smile and said, "So, which theory of the atonement do you hold to?" And he was kind of smiling because he knew it was a trap. Like anyone you pick, you can find people all throughout the history of the church that affirm it, and Scripture to affirm that view of Christ's saving work. I smiled and told him all of them. Yeah. But we're beholden to this pattern of thought, but it shapes our interaction with the history. Okay? So if we're looking for the main theory governing an era, we misread history because those eras weren't governed by main theories. You can find every one of Aulin's main theories that he divides up into chunks of history in Augustine. You can find all of them in Anselm. Anselm is a proponent of Christus Victor. If you read any popular book on the atonement, there's the first 1,000 years of the church, and then comes along the revolutionary Anselm. Grosseteste writes a little while later, and he says, well, when it comes to the atonement, Augustine and Anselm figured all that out. It's a shocking sentence to us because we're trained to think Augustine, Christus Victor, Anselm satisfaction. But in Curriculum Homo, book 2, chapter 19, maybe 18, he comes back around to his, he didn't really critique Christus Victor accounts, but he levels a whole set of questions in the voice of Boso to kind of set up the basis for the discussion. He comes back to those in book 2, chapter 19, roughly. And he says, look, God didn't owe anything to Satan. But we did. Actually, what we owed is we owed God a defeat of Satan. But we couldn't do it anymore. So what happened? God became man in order to give to God the defeat of Satan, which we owed. But you can find that everywhere in the patristics. So when we take theories, language, and approach the history with it, we end up misreading it. And there's large-scale consensus to the point of Anselm being a Christus Victor proponent, which makes sense when you read his biography with Eadmer, and he's saying Anselm is walking up and he's like making the sign of the cross and casting a demon out of a fire, and the fire just ceases. And you think, okay, how is this person not a proponent of Christus Victor, right? Okay. So it makes it really difficult for us to read the history of doctrine, and it makes it really difficult to see the synthesis that's present in individual thinkers and across the doctrine. So with that critique of theories in place, what's the way forward? What I've found is to go back not to theory, but to theoria, the Greek word for contemplation. Now, there are different ways of thinking about contemplation. One of the main ways of thinking about it is we contemplate the divine essence. That is the beatific vision, to be awash in the divine essence and in contemplating that. Okay? That's not what I have in mind. I have in mind something along the lines of what Colin Gunton is talking about in his book, Act in Being, and the way that what we contemplate is the divine essence enacted in the life of the triune God, Father, Incarnate Son, and Holy Spirit. And because of that, we contemplate the divine essence in the acts of God, in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Our business is contemplation. What does that mean, and how does that relate to all this theory stuff, though? Okay. There are two main divine attributes that kind of give traction to contemplation so that when we're interacting with the history of doctrine and therefore with Scripture, we can do it well. All right, so two main divine attributes that I've found that really open up the doctrine of the atonement, and they're not your usual suspects. Okay, so it's not justice or love. They are wisdom and divine simplicity. I was reading Jonathan Edwards, and I was bored to death, because I'd already read Francis Turretin, and I did not need more Francis Turretin, and most of his stuff on the doctrine of the atonement was just plagiarizing Francis Turretin, so I was bored to death. And somehow, miraculously, I believe, I stumbled across his sermons, The Wisdom of God Displayed in the Way of Salvation. What had been just plagiarism became the most lively account of the doctrine I had ever seen. He's talking about angels and the Trinity, all the divine attributes, all this stuff related to the death and resurrection. I asked, well, why? Why is he lively here and boring here? And I realized, wisdom, thinking about God's wisdom is forcing him to do this. Wisdom has to do both with an understanding of things and with how to navigate the relations between them in order to bring about good action. So God, who is both the source of all things and therefore knows all things, and yet in his action is able to keep in mind all things and their purposes, is a wise God. All throughout Scripture, God acts in a way that is wise. He is the source of everything that we pursue in pursuing wisdom. Right? Because he is the wise God, he is able to hold in account all things and their relations and act in a way that responds to them appropriately in the death and resurrection of Christ. If we think about wisdom of God, we end up not just thinking about maybe our sin or our guilt. We end up thinking about the fall and how it relates to angels. We can think about the fall and how it relates to the groaning of creation. We can think about the fall and and nations. All of these are relevant. It's not just that we're sinners. The atonement affects all of these things, and keeping in mind God's wisdom helps us keep in mind not just God and ourselves, but God and all things in relation to God, as Thomas Aquinas would be so happy for me to say. Okay? So what keeping in mind wisdom does is it helps us think about all the aspects of Christ's saving work, which far exceed dealing with our individual sin, but they include that. Okay? That's one of the key ways of reappropriating the synthesis held by the tradition. Right? It's because we can when I don't know, some random monk is exploring some aspect of Christ's work that we've never contemplated before, it's not threatening. It's like, the wise God is able to keep all this in mind, and by one elegant action is able to resolve all of these different problems. Yeah. The other divine attribute to keep in mind is that of divine simplicity. Now, there are philosophical ways of developing this doctrine primarily as reflections upon being itself. Okay? I'm not against those, but those aren't the ones that I find the most traction with. The way that, again, Gunton in his Act in Being book, Paul Hinlicky, who is a roller coaster to read, but there's an underlying line of thought where he's grappling with this line of thought. Bart as well. The account of divine simplicity rooted in the triune life of God as a reflection on God's triunity. That account of divine simplicity I find endlessly generative within the doctrine of the atonement, and I'll try to unpack that just a little bit. But basically, it's rooted from the reflection of the unity of the divine life, the unity of the divine character as enacted in the economy of salvation. We'll find statements like this. Like here's one from Irenaeus. God is utterly like himself. We're so used to negative accounts of divine simplicity, no parts. So there is a strong apophatic line in this doctrine, but there's also a positive line of saying God is entirely like himself. This is to take a little more Bartian approach. Everything that God is in everything that he does. It's a way of saying, of affirming the plurality of God's character in the unity of his life and act. Okay. What does that do to the doctrine of the atonement? It does two things. One, affirming this version of divine simplicity. I know I didn't unpack it at length, but I only get so long. It allows us to do deep dives into the doctrine of the atonement from the standpoint of one divine attribute. We're really used to this when it comes to justice, right? Everyone has read an account. God is the just God. We have sinned against him. Because we've sinned against the just God, we're guilty, and we can go on from there. What happens if we explore the doctrine of the atonement as a work of God's power? Entirely different nuances sort of rise to the surface. We end up thinking about different aspects of the biblical witness, different accounts of what sin is. Like Nietzsche leaps to mind all of a sudden, and before we were able to forget about him, things like that. So thinking about divine simplicity allows us, for the time being, to think through what is the death and resurrection from the standpoint of this divine attribute, because God is this, without having to feel nervous about it. God is wise. How is the atonement a work of his wisdom? It brings up an entirely different, like all of a sudden we're thinking about Proverbs in a way that we wouldn't have been thinking about if we were thinking in terms of justice, perhaps. That's one motion that this pushes, like the temporary excursions into one area shaped by one divine attribute. The second move that it does is that it immediately then demands a corresponding synthetic move to say, how do these relate to each other? So it allows us to dive into divine goodness, but then ask, but how does divine goodness relate to the divine constancy? And allow that to shape our thinking and interpretation of, Athanasius, who is utterly animated by the superlative consistency of the Father, for example. Okay. Now, that was all theoretical. It's basically a rough draft of the next book I'm working on to do with method in the doctrine of the atonement. So let's get concrete about it. How does this relate to the biblical work that we've just seen? Most of this is going to be about Gary's work because I got to read it before the conference. So apologies to Mark. So why does this kind of work matter? Now, it can matter on its own terms, like, hey, studying scripture is the lifeblood of the church, utterly delightful for its own sake. Let's just do this, okay? But then it's easy to kind of set things aside in two different ways when it comes to doing theology, which we still have to do. One is to just ignore it and like, okay, now let's talk about penal substitution. Like, oh, what a loss. Or the other option is to then force and straitjacket sacrificial terminology into those discussions that we want to have about penal substitution. Again, what a loss, either way. So here's why I think this earlier discussion, or the two discussions, really matter. At root, I believe they are sustained explorations of the atonement in terms of divine holiness. Like holiness animates the whole project of how can a people be in the presence of a holy God and not be simply consumed or destroyed? Like, I'm afraid about saying anything to do with the Old Testament in the presence of these two, but whatever. So it allows the first two papers give us a sustained exploration of the atonement in terms of holiness. And that brings attention to the Old Testament in its own right and the distinctive voice of the New Testament on that same subject. So, for example, we haven't even talked about David Moffat yet and Hebrews and all that awesome stuff. There is such delight in thinking about God as a holy God, and how does the Old Testament and the New Testament unpack that work. And it's utterly different from categories beholden to God as a just judge who gives law, and thinking in terms of justice and righteousness. They're not at odds with each other. They're just different modes of thought. And to explore one of them is a joy. And there's a little example of that. It brings to mind a whole set of categories like clean and unclean. Like I don't think my students think in terms of these categories, but it sure helped me, because when we went, let's see, my third born was 1, and we were going to go to a university event. We were going to hear a World War II veteran telling his story. So we asked one of my students to babysit our 1-year-old. That student in high school had an abortion, and she felt utterly, what I realized is she felt like she would contaminate my family by bringing herself into the presence of my family. And it was really difficult for her to do that. It was also really restoring to be caring for my 1-year-old. But to watch and see, this is a clean, unclean thing. She's worried about contaminating my family. And so the role of, carefully, but hugging her, inviting her into our home, going through this whole process to a point where eventually she just came and spent a whole week with my family. It was a beautiful thing. These categories matter so much, and to have so many of them at our disposal rather than just 1 or 2 is pastorally immensely relevant. Okay. And then the work matters because it joins a long conversation that's happening theologically. I'm thinking of Matthew Levering, Forsyth, Barth, Torrance. There's just a whole sweep of theological resources that are trying to think through what is theology, or what is the theological task when done in light of divine holiness. Yeah. So I think these projects matter immensely for the riches of the church. But now let's have some critique, because that's fun. I realized as we were talking last night, and as you're giving your paper today, Gary, that I think I was swimming upstream reading the book because of the subtitle. I expected it to be kind of a comprehensive account of the tabernacle. And I think if I had read it with the subtitle, Atonement and Tamid, when I had that realization, this is mostly about Tamid, all of a sudden I was able to swim downstream, which of course is a lot easier. Okay. Not that they're at odds, but it changes the order a little bit in my mind. Let me try to unpack that a little bit. You mentioned that the line of thought that you're unpacking helps us get away from a punitive modality in the sacrificial system. Okay, amen to that. I don't think that, but then I question, does that help us to get away from a negative modality in the sacrificial system? Now, some of this has to do with our conversation earlier about kind of order, the way that you're trying to order things from a positive, even if we hadn't fallen perspective. And that really helped me to understand that. But so that's where the debate between Thomas and Scotus is so important. I'm about as sympathetic to Scotus and Grosseteste before him as any of my friends. I absolutely love that line of thought. I think they can be right, and that is the genuine order of things. And Thomas can still be right in that even if God would have become incarnate anyway, God became incarnate under conditions of the fall, and therefore the order that you present doesn't change the fact that emphasis can be distorted or can be changed because of the fall. So the two are complementary. The order that you laid out, I think, is correct, but the emphasis can be different from the order and not governed by the order, because the emphasis is shaped by the fall. That means that there's a corresponding negative modality to the sacrificial system, even if there isn't a punitive modality to it. And the negative modality that I have in mind is the way that whenever anyone enters the tabernacle or temple in an unfit, unprepared, unholy way, They are struck down, killed. That whole line of thought, and then the whole line of thought having to do with the cleansing that has to be done in order for this people to be able to remain in God's presence without being destroyed. That threat that sort of is the background to the system. I think we need to hold that in tandem with the order that you are so winsomely presenting. That then helps bring to the fore things like Leviticus 16, Hebrews, or Jesus' statement, destroy this temple, I would raise it up again. Like, why does God destroy the tabernacle or the temple? Why is Christ, who is tabernacling with us, destroyed and then reestablished? That destruction and reestablishment, it holds together both the negative and the positive. I just didn't hear that clearly enough, and I was really missing it. And hopefully it's clear, not just because of penal substitution. I think that's established on other grounds. It has to do with the logic of sacrifice and its negative modality. So anyway, I'd love to hear more about that. That leaves a host of theological questions to be explored along these lines, which I'm so appreciative. One is thinking through sin as pollution. So a huge question in the doctrine of the atonement is obviously, what is the relation of the incarnate God to our sin? Is he utterly immune from it? It has no contact with him. He is just the clean one, the holy one in our midst. Is something imputed or reckoned to him? Is he our federal head? Is he, because of Colossians and the way that all things hold together in him, is our sin in some way his sin? Even though he didn't sin himself personally, those who are held together in him sinned, and therefore sin is simply his. Like, how do we account for this? In some way, he's doing something to do with our sin. What's the connection? The way that the tabernacle has to be cleansed through blood, and David Moffat really helped me understand all this, seems so important. The tabernacle would simply become, and I'd love to be corrected on this, but the tabernacle would be contaminated by being in the presence of Israel. And so we end up atoning for the strangest things in Leviticus. We do atonement for the tabernacle, for garments, for the altar, like things that I don't assume need atoning. I think of human guilt. But in the Levitical system, as I understand it, because sin is contagious, the tabernacle absorbs the pollution of the people of Israel and has to be cleansed with the blood. That seems to bring up a whole set of resources for thinking about Christ as sin bearer. How does he bear sin? He bears sin in the same way that the tabernacle does, by simply being in its presence. It's polluting. And then, so why does he die and rise again? In order to cleanse himself with his own blood. And that's where we get all these mixed weaving together of things in Hebrews that's so fascinating. That seems to be a really important line of thought that I would love to see developed. A second one is the whole logic of the destruction and the rebuilding of the temple. And again, maybe I'm misspeaking when I tie together tabernacle and temple. I think I'm safe in doing that. But I would love to see more of that. The final thing that really comes to mind, probably the most surprising thing for me, and maybe we can talk about it over dinner at some point or something like that, was there was the move early in the last chapter to the doctrine of theosis using, I think, Khaled Anatolios and Andrew Louth. Does one say Louth or Luth? Louth? Okay. I've never heard it said. So anyway, I've read lots, and he is amazing. One of the things that I believe you wrote was that you used theosis as a way of getting away from negative modalities within the doctrine of the atonement. Not that those were improper, but just to reflect on a different line of thought. Here's my concern. I have a couple of concerns about that. One is the way Anatolios argues, and I think this was a soft argument on his part, was that it's deification through the cross, so that negative modalities are an intrinsic part of the overall schema of theosis. So I don't think moving towards theosis helps us get away from negative modalities. They're utterly bound together. And I've got, I don't know, a bookshelf of contemporary studies tracing the doctrine of deification or theosis across the whole Western and Eastern tradition, showing how it's just a universal teaching of the church. And it's like in Anselm and Aquinas, Jonathan Edwards, C.S. Lewis, it's just everywhere. Now, whether it rises to the state of a doctrine or whether it's a mere theme, I don't know whether that distinction actually helps that much anyway. But so I wonder whether that move to theosis helps the argument. But the most promising part of that move that I would love to see develop more is, and again, this is all about trying to develop, how do we, if we think about the atonement in terms of divine holiness, which we can and should do, how does it help us see Christ's work differently? The way that Christ says, hey, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. But that the whole point of the tabernacle and temple, at least as I understand it, was to be a dwelling place of God where the glory of God would fill it so intensely that all these things had to be done so that creatures wouldn't just be destroyed in its presence. Or the positioning of the tribes around and the Levites around, everything to kind of keep, actually, it was simultaneously to keep people near to God and to keep enough distance so they just wouldn't be destroyed and annihilated by the holiness and glory of God. So that Jesus, as in the resurrection, is the reestablishment of the tabernacle, the temple, in whom we behold his glory. That would be like the culmination of that. And we beheld his glory in the resurrection. We get a glimpse of it in the transfiguration. That seems to have so many resources proper to holiness, tabernacle, and temple to think of deification, uniting the negative and positive modes. That I like, oh, I want it. But then I guess my problem is I just wanted the last chapter to be the whole book. But that's fair. You get to write one chapter on something. I understand that. So I'll back up. To understand the doctrine of the atonement, we need to get away from theory language. Theory language is beholden to a whole pattern of thought that actually distorts our interaction with history and with biblical interpretation. If instead we go with theoria, a way of contemplation, which aims at appropriating the riches, and we use contemplation in a manner guided by the work of the triune God, and through the work of Jesus' death and resurrection, rather than just contemplation of the divine essence, in a way guided by God's wisdom and his simplicity, I think it funds this kind of study and theological appropriation of it to help with these discussions like those of theosis, where we can see them not as a way of getting away from patterns in the thought of the church, but like further, rehabilitating them in constructive ways. That's my attempt at situating these kinds of discussions and trying to invigorate them theologically and open up new avenues of research in the history of doctrine.
Thanks so much, Adam. Thank you for bringing yourself and your own ideas, but also interacting with other things that were going on, both sort of on the paper, but also said this morning aloud. So who would like to ask the first question? There's Joe Mangina's hand up right away.
Adam, thank you for that lovely paper. Your Theoria essay, I think, is already a contemporary classic and has been very helpful to many people to untangle some of these knots. So thank you for that.
Could you send a text to my wife that says that?
Okay, I will. So I have a methodological kind of more remark than question, but then a question. The remark is, I loved what you did with divine wisdom and simplicity, and getting us away from, and what you did with the sort of deconstruction of Schleiermacher in Berlin and the kind of historicism that has crept into our minds as we think about. So each era has to have its one model or whatever. So the thing is, though, you find lots of people nowadays who are happy with let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? So people are more comfortable than they used to be with multiple theories. But I'm not sure that in itself gets beyond the problem, because it becomes a kind of an eclecticism that doesn't have the theological depth and divine being depth that you're working towards. And so
So when I started researching the doctrine of the atonement, I was walking into that state. So it was a response against the old patterns, and all the works I was reading on the atonement were, look, there are all these things going on, and people would come in and basically what had been a historical line of thought took a linguistic turn. And I don't know if the linguistic turn had to do with Yale or postmodernism or what, but it was a way of saying, look, like cultures need different ways of expressing the truth. And there are lots of ways of doing it, and the Bible has lots of ways of doing it. And so find some that suit you. Well, that's so weak. So my search was for, how do we ground this theologically? And it is what force within any account of the atonement is the divine attribute that we employ. And so the key to it is simultaneously exploring all the avenues afforded to us by the divine attributes and affirming divine simplicity so that these are all one. So what you can't do is choose this golf club because you like it and ignore the others, because that's just sub-Christian. Right. So I was trying to find theological resources for holding all this together.
Right. Or even mixing them without holding it together at that divine level. And then the other thing, the more substantive one, when you were talking about the contamination issue and thinking about sin in cultic terms, for example, I mean, you know Ben Myers' essay, The Patristic Theory of Atonement. Now we can set aside the question, is that the patristic theory, right? But when he talks about, for the church fathers, Christ is life itself, his coming into contact with our death and sin and corruption in the incarnation, that destroys death. Death loses in that encounter. That sounds to me like a metaphysical translation of cultic language. It's bringing A together with negative A, and A destroys negative A.
I mean, so I love that chapter of his. It was really well done. There's a way of talking where it almost sounds like the incarnation undoes sin. Just by his presence, sin just can't be present anymore. That doesn't do justice to the process of the sacrificial system. So if he was here, I would want to know, I'd want to hear about that process. Is it just a mathematical one where to be present is to undo? Or does the presence involve in some way taking up and bearing, cleansing, working, doing? That would be my question. Yeah.
Fair enough. Good point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But Ben is really good in that essay. And to be fair, the things that I'm saying about these different theologians, the scholarly work on, on Bernard or on Bonaventure or Athanasius or whatever is really good. It doesn't connect when people want to write about the atonement. So a lot of what I'm doing is synthetic, bringing these things together.
Well, would you like to ask a question? While you're thinking, or they're thinking, or do you have, you brought in David Moffat's idea of a slightly different approach, which emphasizes not so much the death, but the life that Christ brings, or somehow is brought through Christ, the Christ event. My slight trouble with that always is that this life continuing, but is a different form of life that requires a death. So sometimes you don't really escape from the death just by going on about life. So you touched on that, but I wasn't quite sure how it fitted with what you were trying to say.
Yeah. If you haven't read David Moffat's Rethinking, I think it's called Rethinking Atonement. It's a set of essays. They're brilliant, and he's just great. His argument is, if we trace the way that Hebrews is adopting the argument of Leviticus, entirely different concerns come to the foreground when we're thinking about the death and resurrection. So, for example, when an animal is sacrificed, the point isn't the killing of the animal. The point is what you do with the blood. And what do you do with the blood? You use it to cleanse things. Like all the logic is different than judicial logic. Now, he also wholeheartedly affirms unpacking the atonement as a work of the God who is in and of himself just and does a work of justice in the death and resurrection of Jesus, he grounds it in Isaiah. I'm inclined to ground it in the covenant. That's why Mark Boda's first essay was so important, of the two levels, the sacrificial level and the covenantal level, that are kind of intertwined but distinct. And Christ is operating at both levels. And to be able to hold those distinctly and yet in relation is just vital to understanding the scriptural witness, and be able to understand Christ as both upholding the supreme superlative self-consistency of the Father. That's the covenantal language, but also the holiness of God, to be able to do both of those. And so Moffat is working with holiness categories that emphasizes more the work after the resurrecting and ascending work of Christ, whereas which, while still incorporating the death, you can't have the animal's blood without killing it. Bad news for animals. That was a joke. But that isn't at odds with other aspects of the atonement. Again, aspects language is so important. It's not competing theories. We can all have different theories about, why certain food was served today. Those are discrete explanations of phenomenon. To work with aspects is totally different. We could work with the sociology of the food served today, the chemistry of the economics. That would be, those are mutually complementary aspects or dimensions of a thing. That's what the medievals are about. That's what I'm trying to reappropriate.
And if I could just give Gary a 10-second warning, because I'm going to ask him to come in on this. When I read Gary Anderson's book on sin a number of years ago now, so maybe I completely misunderstood. Maybe I misunderstood it then and I've misremembered it since. But I thought that in some sense there was a kind of progressive revelation going on in and through the Bible, where we start off with something kind of mysterious and cultic, and all that, but then it kind of gets transmuted, I suppose is the word, into a kind of calculus of debt, into kind of something that can be understood in terms of money. And that's not too far away from the judicial, because judges have to do, most of the law cases in law that make money for lawyers in London are to do with money and that kind of thing. So it's moving in a progressive way from a sort of rather kind of primitive understanding of what it is for God and humans to relate to each other, to a more kind of business-like, contractual, judicial one, moral one, and that in some sense is progress. Now, what I hear David Moffat and you kind of doing is, well, actually, that was all modernist, and we want to do something a little bit more uncanny and all that kind of thing. Now, Gary, did I misread that book?
I guess partly. I didn't want to, in tracing the development from sin as a burden that individuals bear to a debt that's forgiven, which I think is an unarguable philological fact. I didn't intend to weight them positively and negatively. And I guess the other thing I've said to people in conversation, just because this is the language of the New Testament, I mean, part of that, I began with Ricoeur, that you can't talk about sin without a metaphoric world. And these metaphoric worlds are frequently given by our mother tongue. They're not invented. The language of debt that's part of Second Temple Judaism as a result of, Aramaic and Hebrew that Jesus inherits, that doesn't have to be our language by extension. In other words, we don't have to use that. And I think a lot of people, the Lord's Prayer, most of us don't say, forgive us our debts. We say trespasses. Most people have, I think that, do you? Okay, there you go. I think it's a beautiful language. I think with the rise of capitalism, though, the money element, everyone just sees, once you go into money, you're in the world of Mordor or what have you. And I try to work really hard to correct that, but as a historical project, not so much a normative project. And maybe I just say one thing. I mean, you're certainly correct when I kind of nest the sacrifice as self-donation, the kind of punitive, ameliorative, element doesn't get full due, but that's also the framework of the book. The book wasn't, a full account, of atonement. And the Louth, I was actually arguing against Louth. Louth is frequently trotted out by people who hate penal substitution to present the orthodox view that doesn't, the death of Christ has, no functional value. I don't think Louth actually, means that at all, but he's used that way. And he says sometimes, dumb things that are heard by people in a way he doesn't intend. But my point there was that that sacrifice and incarnation can't be pulled apart. They're not pulled apart in John. He thinks they are. I tried to argue in the tabernacle narrative itself that Exodus 40, the indwelling theme, is linked inextricably from the sacrificial theme of Leviticus 9. And when in John 1:14, we have that, intertextual reference clearly to Exodus 40, as Mark Boda pointed out. It's also, we saw his glory, which later in the Gospel of John is the glory of his cruciform, nature, which then you're in Leviticus 9 tied back to Genesis 22. And you can't, Louth thinks you can pull them apart. You can't pull them apart.
Okay.
But what I liked about Louth when I came back, I thought it was artful. Maybe for some people it was confusing. Is I said, but Louth isn't completely wrong. In other words, there is a sense in which both sacrifice and incarnation have, a utility, validity apart from human sin. And if he had that sense of sacrifice, he wouldn't have had to go the route he did. But I'd have to give a whole nother lecture on the punitive side, where it all fits in. I'm not going to do that because, that's, not the purpose of the conference, and don't want to steal your time.
But that would be great fun. I would love that. To get away from that model where there's a shift from the early, sacrificial, obscure thing to the more developed. Yeah, like the New Testament just doesn't allow that. And so in my way of trying to help people see that is everyone wants to affirm this is a holy God. So let's explore how this is the work of the holy God. And in those terms, it's like, well, yeah, let's do that. So I to not put those at odds. And a big part of what I'm trying to do is to try to get away from metaphor language. And not because there aren't metaphors. There are, and language is surely metaphorical. It has to have a backing theologically, like in reality. And so my way of accessing that is to say, the reason that there are metaphors and that metaphors work is because reality is both one and diverse, rooted in the unity and diversity of God's own being. So that I've tried to take it to the metaphor language to the level of divine attributes. And at that level, I found it to have some real theological strength that gets away from sort of culturally conditioned talk. And our penal system has changed, so we don't need penal substitution anymore. It's like, no. We can't go the simply linguistic or metaphorical route. I want to go with the being of God that animates the whole discussion. That's why we have those kinds of metaphors. So that's not a critique. That reminded me of that. Hopefully it's really clear. I love your book, and anything that will help me understand some aspect of the biblical witness that I wasn't attending to earlier that I can incorporate into the work of Christ, to me is like wonderful. Like, for example, a wave offering. What is a wave offering? I don't have a clue. And so to have Matt just waved at me. So to have the tamid now prominent in my mind as an aspect of the work of Christ is like, oh, well, that's, this is wonderful to me. So
I think I have time for one last question before we have to have a break, but yeah, sure.
Thank you for your wonderful talk, Adam. I have sort of a practical question. I find myself in the awkward position as an Anglican priest and a new Anglican priest, often ministering to people in my parents' generation or older, who seem to have a lot more hang-ups with the doctrine of the atonement and just talk of the cross than people my age and younger who seem to be, those who are sort of discovering or rediscovering Christianity, kind of like curious about the cross and find it to be less thorny, I suppose. Do you have any sense of sort of what's going on behind the scenes, what's happening there? In terms of, I guess, recent history, why are these things so coded? Your 2 cents.
Basically, up until Calvin died, there was room for the doctrine to be mostly joyful and creative. There just weren't a lot of sort of arch heresies that needed to be responded to. And so Like if you read Calvin and Aquinas side by side, there's just a lot of agreement. It's phenomenal. Right after he dies, because of Socinus and that critique, like the reformers felt, my gosh, we have to defend against this. And all that creativity that you find in Calvin, and like, look, I'm not a Calvin fanboy. I did like I just read all through the Institutes with my students this last semester. It was hard work for me. All that creative, joyful freedom condensed down into, we have to defend against this heresy by arguing for penal substitution, created a polemic context. And then with the Berlin stuff that I'm talking about, that became even more intensified. And so it became a big conflict. That's like the 1 minute version, because I know I need to not go long. My response to that is primarily like, so T.F. Torrance helped me read Athanasius, who helped me read 1 Corinthians 15. And those three together just wrecked how I think about the doctrine by emphasizing the resurrection. They made it a joyful doctrine in my mind. The doctrine of the atonement is about the restoration of all things in the resurrection. It's primarily a joyful doctrine that includes an utterly negative component, but it's primarily about the resurrection. So I think my first 3 book covers were either green or plants or Easter lilies. It's just because resurrection is the way to think about the atonement, and that's my way in, but that's a longer conversation too, and I'm probably out of time. It's not awkward to be an Anglican priest. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And thank you.